I never expected a simple wooden gazebo to turn into a federal safety issue, but that's exactly what happened. And honestly, if someone had told me this story a few years ago, I probably would have thought they were exaggerating. The whole thing started on an ordinary Thursday afternoon when I pulled into my driveway after work and noticed something sticking up over the grass behind my property. At first, I didn't think much about it. Out where I live, people are always building sheds, repairing fences, moving equipment around, so seeing a few wooden posts in the distance wasn't exactly headline news. Still, something fell off. My property sits along the edge of a small rural airstrip outside of town I'll call Willow Creek. It's the kind of place most people never notice unless they live nearby. No commercial flights, no giant terminals, no crowds. Just a narrow runway where crop dusters, hobby pilots, and flight students come and go throughout the year. The airstrip had been there long before most of the homes around it were built. In fact, when I bought my land nearly 12 years ago, one of the first things the surveyor explained was that a corner of my back field overlapped with a protected aviation approach corridor. It wasn't a big deal. It simply meant certain height restrictions existed in that area. Trees had to stay trimmed. Permanent structures couldn't exceed specific limits. Everybody around there knew the rules because they'd been around forever. For years, nobody had a problem with it. Then my new neighbors arrived. Their names were Derek and Melissa Parker. They moved in a house next door about 6 months before all this happened. At first, they seemed perfectly nice. Friendly smiles, casual waves, the usual conversations people have when they're trying to settle into a new neighborhood. But over time, I started noticing a pattern. Every conversation somehow drifted toward the open land behind our properties. Derek especially seemed fascinated by the runway. He'd stand near the fence and watch planes descend toward the strip like he was front row at an air show. One afternoon he laughed and said, "Man, if I could sit out here with a beer and watch those planes every evening, I'd never need cable television again." I laughed too. At the time, it sounded harmless. Looking back, maybe that should have been my first clue. About a month later, those wooden posts appeared. The next day, there were more of them. Then support beams. Then framing. Every afternoon something new had been added. By the weekend, what started as a few posts had become a full-blown construction project. A large gazebo stood near the back corner of our properties with a raised deck, decorative railings, and a peaked roof tall enough to stand out against the horizon. I remember stopping my truck halfway down the driveway and just staring at it. Not because it looked bad. Actually, it was pretty well built. The problem was where it was sitting. Something about its placement immediately bothered me. Years of walking that field had made me familiar with every fence marker and survey stake. The gazebo looked wrong, like a picture hanging slightly crooked on a wall. Most people wouldn't notice it. I did. That evening I dug out the original survey documents from a filing cabinet in my office. I spread them across the kitchen table and started comparing measurements. The more I looked, the more uneasy I became. The next morning I walked the property with a measuring tape and locator map. It didn't take long to confirm what my gut had already suspected. The gazebo wasn't close to the property line. It wasn't touching the property line. It was several feet inside my property. I actually laughed when I realized it, because the situation felt so ridiculous. Who builds an entire structure without checking where the boundary is? But the laughter didn't last. The deeper issue wasn't even the trespassing. The gazebo sat directly inside the protected aviation approach corridor, the exact area where height restrictions existed. In other words, they hadn't just built on my land. They had built in one of the worst possible locations they could have chosen. I spent most of that day debating what to do. Part of me wanted to march over there immediately. Another part wanted to assume it was an honest mistake. I've always believed most neighbor disputes escalate because people stop talking to each other. So that evening, I walked next door and knocked on Derek's door. He answered with a smile. "Hey, Ryan," he said. "What do you think of the gazebo?" I glanced past him toward the backyard and said, "Honestly, it looks nice. There's just one problem." His smile faded slightly. "What's that?" "It's on my property." For a moment, I expected surprise. Maybe embarrassment. Maybe even an apology. Instead, Derek shrugged. Actually shrugged. "Really," he said. "It's only a few feet." I remember staring at him, waiting for the rest of the sentence. waiting for him to laugh and tell me he'd move it. But he didn't. The field back there isn't being used for anything, he continued. I figure it wouldn't matter. That's when I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was entitlement. And unfortunately, things were about to get much more complicated than either of us expected. I stood there for a second trying to process what he'd just said, because in my mind there are certain things people simply don't say out loud. Most folks, when they find out they've accidentally crossed onto someone else's property, immediately start apologizing and figuring out how to fix it. Derek acted like he'd borrowed a garden hose without asking. I took a slow breath and said, "Derek, it matters because it's my land." He folded his arms and looked past me toward the field. "Come on, Ryan. Nobody's using that corner. It's just grass." That sentence stuck with me because it revealed exactly how he saw the situation. To him, ownership only mattered if he personally understood the purpose of something. If he couldn't see a use for it, then it might as well belong to whoever wanted it. I pointed toward the gazebo. The property line isn't the only issue. That structure is inside the approach corridor for the runway. He laughed, not a nervous laugh, a dismissive one. "It's a gazebo, not a skyscraper." Melissa appeared beside him and added, "We're just trying to enjoy the view." I nodded. I understand that, but there are regulations for that area. Derek shook his head. Nobody's going to care. The conversation ended right there because I realized I wasn't talking to someone who disagreed with me. I was talking to someone who had already decided the rules didn't apply to him. I went home frustrated but surprisingly calm. Maybe it was because I knew arguing wouldn't solve anything. Maybe it was because the answer seemed obvious. Either way, I sat down at my desk that night and pulled up the airstrip records. The approach corridor wasn't some unofficial local guideline. It was documented, surveyed, registered. There were maps showing exact measurements and height limitations. Everything was in black and white. The next morning, I made a phone call. Not to a lawyer, not to the county, not to the sheriff. I contacted the regional aviation office responsible for oversight of small airfields in our area. The woman who answered sounded professional but routine, like she'd heard every possible complaint imaginable. I explained where the structure was located and why I believed it might be an obstruction. She asked a few questions, took notes, and thanked me. The entire call lasted less than 10 minutes. When I hung up, I honestly didn't expect much to happen. Government agencies aren't exactly famous for moving quickly. Life returned to normal for about a week. The gazebo remained standing. Derek continued sitting inside it every evening as if he were making a point. Sometimes I'd see him wave at passing planes. Once he even invited friends over for a backyard barbecue. Every time I looked out my kitchen window, there was sitting on my land like some giant wooden monument to bad decisions. Then one Tuesday morning, everything changed. I was drinking coffee when I noticed a white SUV pull into the area near the runway. A man stepped out carrying a clipboard and several pieces of equipment. He wasn't dressed like a county inspector. He looked more official than that. Within 15 minutes, he was walking the field behind my property, measuring, taking notes, looking through instruments. I had a feeling exactly why he was there. About an hour later, there was another vehicle, then another. Apparently, my little phone call had generated more interest than I expected. The lead inspector eventually introduced himself as Martin Graves. He explained that they were evaluating a reported obstruction inside the documented approach path associated with the airstrip. He was polite, but very methodical. Nothing about him suggested a man looking for excuses. If anything, he seemed determined to verify every detail before reaching a conclusion. I walked the property with him while he reviewed maps and measurements. Several times he stopped, checked coordinates, and compared them against official charts. What stood out most was how little attention he paid to opinions. He wasn't interested in what Derek thought. He wasn't interested in what I thought. He only cared about facts. At one point, he looked toward the gazebo and said, almost casually, "If the measurements are what they appear to be, this could be a significant obstruction." Significant. The word surprised me because from a distance the gazebo didn't seem that large. But aviation safety works differently. A structure doesn't have to be huge to create a problem. It simply has to exist in the wrong place at the wrong height. By late afternoon, Derek had finally noticed the activity. He walked across the yard looking annoyed. "What's all this?" he demanded. Martin calmly introduced himself and explained the inspection. Derek immediately became defensive. "You're telling me this little gazebo is somehow dangerous?" Martin didn't react emotionally. "We're determining whether it complies with clearance requirements. It's barely taller than a pickup truck. That isn't the standard we're evaluating." I watched the conversation from a few yards away. Derek kept trying to reduce the issue to common sense, while Martin kept bringing it back to regulations and measurements. It was like watching two people speak entirely different languages. The inspection continued for several more hours. By the end of the day, Martin and his team had enough information to reach a conclusion. I knew it before they said anything. Their expressions told the story. The numbers weren't even close. 2 days later, official notices began arriving. The first letter outlined the property boundary violation. The second addressed the aviation obstruction issue. Combined together, they created a problem much larger than a simple neighbor dispute. The structure had been erected across surveyed private property and within a protected approach corridor associated with a registered runway. Corrective action was required immediately. Derek was furious. For the first time since this started, he came to my house instead of the other way around. He knocked so hard I thought he might break the door. The moment I opened it, he launched into a speech about government overreach, unnecessary regulations, and neighbors who couldn't mind their own business. I listened quietly until he finally ran out of steam. Then I said something that seemed to make him even angrier. "I gave you a chance to move it." His face turned red. "You called federal authorities over a gazebo." "No, Europea. You built a gazebo on someone else's land inside a protected flight corridor." For a second, he had no response. Because beneath all the anger, he knew it was true. The following week was uncomfortable for everyone. Contractors visited the property. Surveyors returned. Additional photographs were taken. Every day seemed to bring another document or another inspection. The tension spread through the neighborhood. Some people quietly supported me. Others thought I should have handled things differently. One neighbor actually told me, "You could have just let him keep it." I asked whether he'd feel the same way if someone built a structure in his backyard without permission. He didn't answer. That's the funny thing about property rights. People often dismiss them until it's their property involved. Through all of this, the thing that surprised me most wasn't Derek's behavior. It was Melissa's. Early on, she had supported every decision. But as the situation worsened, I started noticing cracks. One afternoon, I overheard her arguing with Derek near the garage. Their voices carried across the yard. She sounded exhausted. "I told you we should have checked first," she snapped. Derek muttered something I couldn't hear. Then she said, much louder, "You always think the rules don't apply to you." That sentence lingered in my mind because it sounded less like a comment about the gazebo and more like years of frustration finally boiling over. A few days later, I saw her sitting alone on the back patio, staring at the structure. Not enjoying it, just looking tired. Maybe she understood where this was heading before Derek did. Maybe she realized the gazebo had become a symbol of something much larger than a construction mistake. Whatever the reason, the confidence that had once surrounded the project was gone. The countdown had begun, and everyone knew it. The demolition crew arrived on a cool Friday morning just after sunrise. I remember standing on my back porch with a cup of coffee, watching headlights move across the field while a thin layer of fog still hung over the grass. It felt strange because the gazebo had only existed for a few weeks, yet somehow it had already become the center of every conversation in the neighborhood. What started as a simple structure had turned into a lesson about boundaries, entitlement, and the consequences of assuming you can take something that doesn't belong to you simply because nobody stops you immediately. The workers didn't waste any time. They parked a flatbed trailer near the fence line, unloaded their tools, and got straight to work. Derek came outside, looking defeated. Gone was the confidence he'd shown the day I first confronted him. Gone was the smirk. Gone was the attitude. He looked like a man watching an expensive mistake unfold in real time. For a moment, I actually felt a little sorry for him. Not because the gazebo was coming down, but because the entire situation could have been avoided with a 5-minute conversation and a little humility. The roof came off first. Piece by piece, the structure started shrinking. The decorative railings disappeared next. Then the support beams. The sound of drills, hammers, and power tools echoed across the field, while small planes occasionally passed overhead on their approach to the runway, almost as if they were witnessing the outcome themselves. By lunchtime, half the gazebo was gone. By mid-afternoon, only the raised platform remained. A few hours later, even that had vanished. When the final boards were loaded onto the trailer, all that remained was flattened grass and a patch of disturbed soil. The field looked almost exactly the way it had before the project ever began. The entire thing had taken less than a day to erase. Watching it disappear reminded me how quickly bad decisions can unravel. People spend weeks, months, sometimes years building something on the wrong foundation. And when reality finally catches up, it can all come apart in a matter of hours. As the crew packed up their equipment, Martin Graves happened to stop by for one final inspection. He walked the area, reviewed a few notes, and confirmed the obstruction had been removed. Before leaving, he glanced toward the runway and said something I've thought about many times since then. Most regulations exist because somebody got hurt before they were written. Then he got into his vehicle and drove away. That simple sentence changed how I looked at the entire situation. So many people treat rules as inconveniences. They assume regulations exist to make life harder. But often they're written because someone paid a price years earlier and nobody wanted to see the same thing happen again. Later that evening, I saw Melissa loading boxes into her SUV. Not moving out, just cleaning up and reorganizing things around the house. As she walked past the fence, she stopped and looked toward me. For a second, neither of us said anything. Then she sighed and shook her head. This never should have happened. I nodded. No, it shouldn't have. She gave a tired smile and walked away. It was the closest thing to an apology I ever received. Derek never apologized. Not then. Not later. In fact, we barely spoke after that. We weren't enemies, but we certainly weren't friends. We became the kind of neighbors who acknowledge each other's existence with a brief nod and keep walking. Honestly, that was probably for the best. The months passed, and eventually the story faded from local conversation. New topics replaced it. New neighborhood dramas appeared. Life moved on the way it always does. Yet every now and then, when I sit outside in the evening and watch a small plane line up at the runway in the distance, I think about that gazebo. Not because I miss it. Not because I regret what happened. I think about how differently the entire situation could have ended. If Derek had listened during that first conversation, the structure could have been relocated. The money could have been saved. The embarrassment could have been avoided. Instead, pride took control of the steering wheel. And pride has a funny way of convincing people they're winning right up until the moment everything falls apart. Even now, some people believe I overreacted. I've seen comments online from people who say I should have ignored it because it was only a few feet of land. Others say federal authorities never should have been involved. Maybe some of them are right. Maybe there were other ways to handle it. But here's the question I still come back to. If someone knowingly built a structure on your property, then refused to move it after being told the truth, what would you have done? Would you have let it stay? Would you have accepted the excuse that the land wasn't being used? Or would you have defended your property and the safety rules that existed long before either neighbor moved into the area? That's the part people still argue about, and honestly, I suspect they always will. So now I want to hear from you. Was I justified for making that call? Or did I escalate the situation too far? If you were standing in my shoes, watching a neighbor build on your land and inside a protected flight corridor, what would your next move have been? Drop your thoughts in the comments below because this is one of those stories where everybody seems to have a different opinion. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who appreciates a good lesson about boundaries, consequences, and what happens when common sense collides with entitlement.